The amount has been doubled. Sign it, and you will leave this house before sunset." The Duke of Blackwood pushed the separation settlement toward his wife, while 12 witnesses watched from the long dining table. Duchess Eleanor did not look at the sum written across the first page. Beyond the window, a carriage waited with her trunks already strapped to its roof. They had prepared her disappearance before asking for her consent. She looked at the empty space where the receiving bank should have been named. For 6 years, she had prevented Blackwood's estates from collapsing beneath unpaid debts. She had renegotiated leases, recovered neglected rents, and created a pension fund for the soldiers' widows who lived in the northern villages. Now Julian intended to cast her aside as though none of it had mattered. Beside him stood Sir Gideon Harcourt, his political advisor and cousin. Gideon's fingers rested upon the back of Julian's chair with the quiet confidence of a man already occupying another person's place. "You have been offered more generosity than any estranged wife could reasonably expect," Gideon said. "His Grace asks only for discretion." Eleanor raised her eyes to Julian. "Discretion about our separation," she asked, "or about where this money came from?" A muscle tightened beside his mouth. "This is not another examination of my accounts. They were once our accounts. They ceased to be your concern when you accused my steward of theft before members of my own household. I asked why 40 widows had received no pension since Michaelmas. You embarrassed me, and they went hungry." The witnesses shifted in their chairs. Most had been invited from among Julian's political allies. They had not come to determine whether Eleanor had been wronged. They had come to certify that the Duke had paid handsomely to remove an inconvenient wife. Julian tapped the document. "You have until sunset." Eleanor picked up the silver pen. Relief passed across his face so quickly that she nearly mistook it for regret. Gideon did not hide his satisfaction at all. She read the amount once more. £40,000, twice what her marriage articles required Julian to provide if they lived separately. Then Eleanor drew a firm line through half the sum. The nib scratched loudly across the paper. Gideon's hand left Julian's chair. "What are you doing?" Julian demanded. "Accepting what was promised to me." She wrote £20,000 beside her name. Beneath it, she directed the remainder into the pension trust she had established 3 years earlier. "The other half will be divided among the families your estate has failed to pay. You cannot distribute my money without my consent." Eleanor placed the pen down. "If it is truly your money, you may refuse. But then, you must explain why it was withdrawn from the widow's account yesterday morning." Silence fell across the room. Julian turned toward Gideon. His cousin recovered first. A temporary transfer was necessary to ensure immediate payment of the settlement. "From a protected pension fund?" Eleanor asked. "There was insufficient ready money elsewhere." "That is impossible." Julian's gaze snapped back to her. "You no longer control the books. You cannot know what is possible." "I know because the Eastern Farms paid their annual rents 12 days ago. Blackwood should have received £32,000. Gideon gave a soft, humourless laugh. "The Duchess appears determined to turn a private separation into a public performance." "No," Eleanor said. "Someone else arranged the performance. I am merely refusing the role written for me." She turned to the final page. The list attached to the settlement contained the names of the 40 widows whose money had supposedly been used only temporarily. A payment date appeared beside every name. According to the record, each woman had received 3 years of pension installments in advance. Julian leaned closer. "You told me these obligations had been settled," he said to Gideon. "They were. The receipts are before you." Eleanor examined the signatures. Each was different at first glance, some slanted, some cramped, some marked with an unsteady cross, yet every downward stroke ended with the same slight hook to the left. One hand had written them all. Her father had taught her to look beyond the shape of a signature. A skilled forger copied letters. An honest investigator studied pressure, hesitation, and habit. Eleanor stopped at the 17th name, Martha Bell. A memory struck her with such force that her fingers tightened around the page. She had stood beside Martha's narrow bed in January, holding the old woman's hand, while the village curate recited the final prayer. Martha had been buried beneath frozen ground 3 days later. According to the document before Eleanor, however, she had entered the estate office in March and signed for £60. Eleanor looked toward the long windows. Beyond them, a carriage waited beside the steps with her trunks already strapped to its roof. Julian had prepared her departure before she had agreed to leave. "Read that name," she said. He glanced down. "Martha Bell. She died in January." No one moved. Gideon reached for the paper. Eleanor pulled it beyond his grasp. "A copying error," he said. "A dead woman's signature is not a copying error." Julian's face hardened, but uncertainty had entered his eyes. Why would anyone forge a pension receipt for £60? "That is the question you should have asked before removing me from the accounts. I will not tolerate another accusation without proof." Eleanor stared at the man she had once trusted with every hope she possessed. Even now, with a dead woman's name beneath his hand, he preferred wounded pride to truth. She folded the list and slipped it into her sleeve. Gideon stepped toward her. "That document belongs to His Grace. It was presented as evidence against the pension fund I established. I will return it after the signatures have been examined." Julian rose. "If you take it, the doubled offer is withdrawn." Eleanor felt the threat land exactly where he intended. Without the settlement, she would have no independent household and no legal means to protect the servants who had remained loyal to her. She removed her wedding ring and placed it upon the unsigned half of the agreement. "Then withdraw it." Julian stared at the ring. Eleanor walked toward the doors, but the footman standing there did not open them. His frightened gaze went past her to Gideon. That was when she understood. The carriage, the witnesses, the missing bank, and the forged receipts had all been prepared before Julian made his offer. They had never expected her merely to leave. They needed her signature before she discovered what else had been stolen in her name. The footman's hand remained frozen above the door latch. Eleanor saw fear in his face, but not defiance. His gaze kept returning to Gideon, whose pleasant expression had vanished. "Open the door," Eleanor said. The young man swallowed. Julian struck the table with his palm. "Did you not hear the Duchess?" Only then did the footman obey. Eleanor stepped into the corridor, carrying nothing except the forged pension list hidden inside her sleeve. She had reached the staircase when Julian followed her. "You will return that paper." "I will return it when I know who wrote the names." "You have no authority to conduct an inquiry. Yesterday you might have been right." She turned to face him. "But today you placed £40,000 before 12 witnesses and asked me to sign without naming the bank, the account, or the source. You made the missing money part of our separation. That gives me both a reason and a duty to question it." Julian lowered his voice. "You have spent months searching for dishonesty because you cannot accept that our marriage has failed." The accusation hurt because a small part of it had once been true. Eleanor had examined every cold conversation and every separate supper, hoping to find one error she could correct. She had believed that if she proved useful enough, patient enough, and loyal enough, Julian might remember the man who had once crossed a crowded room simply because he saw her standing alone. But usefulness had not protected her. It had only made her labor easier to erase. "Our marriage did not fail because I examined the accounts," she said. "You removed me from them because I began finding what you did not wish to see." Julian flinched. For one heartbeat, she thought he might ask what she had found. Then Gideon entered the corridor. "The carriage is waiting," he said. "A prolonged departure will only provide servants with more material for gossip." Eleanor looked down at the entrance hall. Her trunk stood beside the open doors, though no maid had asked which clothes she wished to take. Even the small walnut box containing her father's legal notes had been packed. They had searched her study. She descended the stairs quickly. The box's brass lock was scratched, and one hinge sat slightly crooked. Eleanor opened it. Her father's notebooks remained inside, but the packet containing copies of the pension trust was gone. "Who packed this?" she asked. The housekeeper stepped forward. "2 men from the estate office, Your Grace." Sir Gideon said there was little time. Gideon appeared at the top of the staircase. Every item was handled with care, except the documents proving how the pension trust was funded. Julian came down behind him. "What documents?" "The original rental assignments. 3 years ago, I persuaded 12 landowners to direct a portion of their rents into a protected account. Those payments did not depend upon the estate's yearly profits." Julian frowned. "You told me the fund cost Blackwood £6,000. It did. The remaining money came from voluntary assignments and the interest earned after I transferred the account to a more stable bank." She had spent an entire winter negotiating those terms. She had visited farms in freezing rain, sat in kitchens with grieving mothers, and convinced men who distrusted every lawyer in London that the trust would outlive both generosity and politics. By the following year, no soldier's widow on Blackwood land had needed to beg the parish for bread. Gideon gave a dismissive shrug. If the papers are missing, perhaps the Duchess removed them herself. Eleanor looked at Julian. There, he has accused me again, without offering proof. Will you ask him to search the estate office? I will examine the matter after you leave. By then, whatever remains will be burned. Gideon's expression did not change, but his right thumb rubbed once across the edge of his signet ring. Eleanor recognized the gesture. He had done the same thing during the meeting in which Julian removed her from the accounts. Her boundary became clear. I will leave Blackwood House, she said, but I will not leave the county until each living widow confirms whether she received the money recorded beside her name. That is unacceptable, Julian replied. It is not yours to accept. You withdrew the settlement. Therefore, I have signed no promise concerning where I may reside or whom I may question. Julian stared at her, caught by the consequence of his own threat. Eleanor turned to the housekeeper. Please remove my trunks from that carriage. Send them to the North Dower cottage. Gideon descended the remaining stairs. That property is uninhabitable. I paid for its roof to be repaired last spring. With estate money, he said. With money from my pin allowance. The receipt is in the household book, unless that has disappeared too. A quiet sound came from the open doorway. An elderly clergyman stood on the steps, his black coat marked with dust from the road. Reverend Grant served the 3 northern villages and had worked beside Eleanor when she created the pension trust. He bowed to her, then looked uneasily at Julian. Forgive my arrival without notice, Your Grace. I was told the Duchess would be leaving today. Who told you? Eleanor asked. A messenger from the estate office. He removed a folded note from his coat. He also instructed me to bring the burial register. Gideon's face remained composed. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Why would the estate office request burial records? The clergyman handed her the message. It bore no signature, only the Blackwood seal. She opened the register he carried and found Martha Bell's burial recorded on the 9th of January. Reverend Grant's signature stood beneath it. Were you present when she died? Eleanor asked. I was, as were you. Eleanor turned to Julian. Martha supposedly collected her pension in March. That receipt is false. Julian looked toward Gideon. Find the clerk responsible. There may be a simpler explanation, Gideon said. The widow's payment could have been collected by a relative. Then the relative's name would appear beside hers, Eleanor replied. I wrote that rule myself. Reverend Grant cleared his throat. There is something else you should see. From between the register's pages, he removed a second document. It was an authorization ordering the pension bank to release £20,000 into a temporary estate account. At the bottom appeared Eleanor's countersignature. The document was dated the 9th of January, the same day she had spent beside Martha's deathbed, and later watched Reverend Grant enter the burial in his register. Julian's voice dropped. You signed this? No, Eleanor said. Someone signed my name while I was burying the woman they later claimed was still alive. She held the authorization beside the forged list. The same small hook appeared at the end of every downward stroke. The missing pensions and the doubled settlement were not separate matters. Both had been prepared by the same hand. Julian held the 2 documents beneath the entrance hall lamp. The forged signatures matched. Even he could no longer deny it. Gideon stepped closer. The former pension clerk must have copied the Duchess's hand before he disappeared. Eleanor watched Julian's face. The clerk was dismissed in February, she said. Martha's receipt is dated in March. Julian glanced at Gideon. For the first time, his cousin had no immediate answer. The dates may have been entered later, Gideon said at last. Estate books are corrected after payments are completed. Ah, not mine, Eleanor replied. Every payment was dated in the recipient's presence. Reverend Grant nodded. I witnessed that practice many times. Julian's uncertainty deepened, but pride reached him before reason did. This proves only that someone handled the records carelessly. It does not prove that Gideon stole the money. I did not accuse him by name. You have accused him with every look since he entered this hall. Gideon lowered his eyes with practiced restraint. Eleanor understood the performance. He would not defend himself too fiercely. He wanted Julian to do it for him. "I will send for the bank statements," Julian said. "Until they arrive, no one will speak of forgery outside this house." "The statements should already be in the estate office," Eleanor replied. "They are not," Gideon said. "The bank failed to provide them." "Then how did you calculate the amount available for my settlement?" The question struck cleanly. Julian looked at his cousin again. Gideon's thumb moved across his signet ring. "I relied upon the balance reported by the estate cashier." "Name him." "That is enough," Julian said. It was not an answer, and everyone in the hall knew it. Eleanor handed the burial register back to Reverend Grant, but kept the forged authorization and pension list. "I am going to the Dower cottage." Gideon moved between her and the door. "Those documents cannot leave Blackwood House." Julian hesitated. That hesitation told Eleanor more than any command could have done. A husband who had once trusted her judgment without question was now deciding whether she might be permitted to carry evidence bearing her own name. "The originals may remain," she said. "Reverend Grant will make witnessed copies before I depart." Gideon's composure cracked. "That could take hours. Then I shall miss the sunset." A sound almost like laughter came from one of the older witnesses. Gideon turned, but no one admitted making it. Julian rubbed a hand across his brow. "Make the copies. Eleanor may keep them until the bank answers." It was a small victory, but it changed the room. Gideon had demanded control and failed to receive it. The servants saw it. The witnesses saw it. More importantly, Gideon knew Eleanor had seen it too. By late afternoon, Eleanor's carriage crossed the northern boundary of Blackwood land. Reverend Grant rode beside her, with the copies secured beneath his coat. They had travelled less than a mile when the carriage slowed. Ahead, 2 estate wagons blocked the road outside a row of stone cottages. Men were carrying chairs, bedding, and cooking pots into the mud. A woman stood in the doorway of the nearest cottage, clutching a folded eviction order. Eleanor stepped down before the driver could open the carriage door. "What is happening?" The estate bailiff removed his hat. "Orders from the new office, Your Grace. These households owe rent. They are pension households." "Yes, Your Grace. They cannot owe rent. Their allowances were designed to cover it." The woman held out the order. "They told us you had taken the fund when you left." Eleanor read the document. It claimed the pension trust had been dissolved at her written request that morning. At the bottom appeared the same imitation of her signature. This forgery was not months old. It had been made while she stood in the dining room refusing to sign the settlement. "Put everything back," Eleanor ordered. The bailiff looked toward the second wagon. A young estate officer sat there, holding a leather dispatch case. Sir Gideon's instructions were explicit. Then Sir Gideon may explain them to the magistrate. Removing a widow from trust-supported housing without proper notice violates the tenancy terms. The officer climbed down. "You no longer administer these lands." "No, but the tenancy contracts remain valid, regardless of who administers them." She pointed to the eviction order. "This gives the tenants 3 days to leave. Even if the debt were genuine, you have arrived 3 days early." The bailiff examined the date. His face reddened. The officer snatched the paper from Eleanor. As he turned, a plain wooden tally fell from his dispatch case and landed near her shoe. It was no larger than her thumb, with the number 17 cut into one side and a small crown burned into the other. Eleanor recognized it. Each widow received a matching tally when collecting her pension. The numbered half remained at the village office as proof that the payment had been made in person. Martha Bell's number had been 17. The officer reached for it, but Eleanor placed her boot over the wood. "Where did you get this?" "It belongs to the estate." "It belonged to a dead woman." The bailiff stepped away from the wagons. Eleanor lifted the tally. One edge was darkened, as though it had recently been pulled from a fire. "Return the furniture," she said again. This time, the bailiff obeyed. The woman at the cottage door began to cry. Eleanor took her hand, promising nothing she could not yet guarantee, but by dusk, every bed and chair had been carried back inside. It was only 12 cottages. The stolen fund supported 40 families. Still, Gideon's first attempt to empty the pension homes had failed. At Blackwood House, Gideon listened while the estate officer reported what had happened. Julian stood beside the library fire. "You ordered evictions before the notices expired?" he asked. "A misunderstanding," Gideon replied. "The bailiff was overeager." "And Eleanor's signature?" "Copied onto the wrong form by a junior clerk." The same explanation again. Gideon studied him. Julian had noticed the contradiction, but he had not yet allowed himself to follow it to its conclusion. "You wished the Duchess gone before sunset," Gideon said softly. "I acted quickly to protect your decision. If haste produced errors, the responsibility is mine." Julian looked toward the wedding ring still lying upon the unsigned settlement. "You will correct them." "Of course." Gideon bowed and left the library. Only after the door closed did his expression change. Eleanor had retained the forged papers, stopped the evictions, and taken Martha Bell's tally. If she compared that piece of wood with the office records, she would learn that the fraud extended far beyond unpaid pensions. She was no longer merely an unwanted wife. She was the only person standing between Gideon and everything he had prepared to take. At sunrise, Eleanor placed Martha Bell's wooden tally beside the copied authorization. The number 17 had been cut by hand, but the small crown on its reverse had been burned into the wood with a metal stamp. One side was blackened, while the other remained clean. It had not fallen accidentally into a fire. Someone had tried to destroy it. A knock sounded at the Dower cottage. Reverend Grant entered with a young man whose coat was torn at one shoulder. "This is the clerk who kept the village payment box," the clergyman said. The young man looked scarcely old enough to shave. His eyes remained fixed upon the floor. "Tell her Grace what you told me." The clerk twisted his cap. "Sir Gideon ordered every wooden tally collected 2 weeks ago. He said the Duchess had replaced the system." "I issued no such instruction," Eleanor said. "I know that now. What happened to the tallies?" "We burned them behind the estate office." Eleanor touched the charred edge of number 17. "Why did this one survive?" "It rolled beneath the grate. I found it the next morning and put it in the dispatch case. I was afraid to tell anyone." "Who wrote the pension receipts?" The clerk's face lost what little colour it had. "I copied the names." Reverend Grant stepped closer to him. "Tell all of it." "Sir Gideon gave me samples from old petitions. He said the women had already received their money, but were too ignorant to sign correctly. He told me I was only repairing the records." "And my signature?" I never copied yours, Your Grace. The authorizations arrived already signed." Eleanor believed him. The hand on the widow's receipts was uncertain, a young clerk imitating unfamiliar marks. Her forged countersignature was confident and practiced. 2 people had participated in the fraud. Before she could ask another question, horses stopped outside. The estate bailiff entered, carrying a notice bearing Julian's seal. "By order of His Grace, all pension distributions are suspended until the accounts are examined." The clerk recoiled. The bailiff continued. "The Duchess is forbidden from contacting estate tenants about financial matters. She must also return any tallies, receipts, or copied records removed from Blackwood property." Eleanor read the notice. "If payments are suspended, how will the widows purchase food this week?" "I was given no instruction concerning that. There are 39 living recipients, several support children." "I am sorry, Your Grace. Sorry will not feed them." The bailiff's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Eleanor crossed to her father's walnut box and removed a narrow velvet case. Inside lay the emerald bracelet Julian had given her on their first anniversary. It was the only gift from him she had brought to the cottage. She closed the case and handed it to Reverend Grant. "Take this to the jeweller in Market Harrow. Ask him to advance enough money for 1 month of payments." The clergyman hesitated. "This is worth far more than that." "Then he should have no reason to refuse." The clerk looked up. "You would sell it for us?" Eleanor met his frightened gaze. "I am not selling it for you. I am buying time for the truth to survive." The emeralds left in Reverend Grant's coat pocket. Only when the door closed did Eleanor allow herself to look toward the empty place on the table. That bracelet had once meant Julian saw her as something other than a useful mind. Parting with it felt less like losing jewels than admitting the memory attached to them no longer had a home. She turned away before grief could weaken her voice. "You must leave the county," she told the clerk. He stepped back. "I have no money. You will travel with Reverend Grant to his sister's parish. You will write everything you know and sign it before 2 witnesses. If Sir Gideon finds me, he will say you invented the fraud and acted alone. If you remain here, fear may make that lie possible." The clerk's eyes filled. "He said my mother would lose her cottage if I refused. And now you will help me ensure she does not." By noon, the jeweller had advanced enough money to pay every living widow for 4 weeks. Reverend Grant distributed it inside the parish school, recording each payment openly before 2 witnesses. Eleanor required every recipient to speak her own name and receive a new paper receipt. No copied signatures, no wooden tallies, no private office. It was the clearest accounting Blackwood had seen in months. By evening, Gideon had transformed it into theft. A printed notice appeared at the village inn claiming Duchess Eleanor had admitted mismanaging the pension trust and had sold family jewels to conceal the missing balance. The notice praised Julian for arranging emergency relief. When Eleanor tore one from the wall, 3 tenants watched her with uncertainty rather than gratitude. Gideon had stolen credit for the payments and turned her sacrifice into evidence of guilt. The magistrate's messenger arrived an hour later. "If you continue distributing money in His Grace's name," he warned, "the Duke may petition to restrain your interference with estate business." "I did not use his name. The recipients are his tenants. They are also human beings." "That argument will not decide the legal question." Eleanor looked toward the schoolroom, where the widows were folding their receipts into pockets and worn purses. "Then tell the magistrate I accept responsibility for every pound distributed today." The statement protected Reverend Grant and the frightened clerk. It also placed the full legal risk upon her. She signed it without hesitation. At Blackwood House, Julian read the printed notice Gideon had prepared. "You wrote that Eleanor admitted mismanagement. She sold your bracelet to replace missing funds. That is not an admission. It is the act of a guilty trustee." Julian looked toward the dark windows. He remembered clasping the emeralds around Eleanor's wrist 6 years earlier. She had smiled at him as though the gift mattered because he had chosen it, not because it was costly. A servant entered with a sealed packet. "A messenger from the pension bank, Your Grace." Gideon reached for it, but Julian took it first. Inside lay the original transfer order for £20,000. Eleanor's signature appeared at the bottom. Above it stood the counter-signature of the person who had personally presented the order to the bank, Sir Gideon Harcourt. A letter from the bank manager accompanied it. He requested a private meeting with Julian the following morning and warned him not to show the document to anyone employed in the estate office. Julian read that warning twice. Then he raised his eyes to the cousins standing across from him. For the first time, Julian had been given evidence he could verify without Eleanor's help. All he had to do was choose whether he truly wished to know the truth. Julian laid the bank manager's letter beside the transfer order. "Why is your signature on this document?" Gideon did not reach for the paper. "Because I delivered it. You told me the estate cashier arranged the transfer. He prepared the figures. I carried the order to London." "And Eleanor?" "She signed it before leaving for the northern villages." Julian pointed to the date. "She was at Martha Bell's deathbed. According to a clergyman who has supported her in every dispute. You believe Reverend Grant lied. I believe Eleanor knew precisely which witnesses would defend her." The answer came smoothly, but Julian heard the calculation beneath it. He looked again at the bank manager's warning. "Do not show this document to anyone employed in the estate office." Gideon had overseen that office for 4 months. Why would the bank manager request a private meeting? To protect himself. Once the missing funds are examined, he may claim he accepted the transfer under pressure from Blackwood. "Then I should hear him." Gideon's expression sharpened. "If you meet him privately, you lend credibility to Eleanor's accusation. By tomorrow afternoon, every political ally you possess will hear that the Duke of Blackwood suspects his own cousin of theft. That is not what a private meeting means. It is what others will make it mean." Julian turned toward the fireplace. In 3 days, he was expected in London to accept a government appointment for which his family had waited 2 generations. The position depended upon stability, judgment, and the appearance of an orderly household. A public financial scandal would destroy it. Eleanor had warned him that Gideon used his pride as a blindfold, yet Julian told himself caution was not blindness. He needed time. He needed control. Above all, he needed the matter resolved without humiliation. A second document waited upon his desk. Gideon had prepared it that afternoon. It removed Eleanor as trustee of the pension fund and appointed Gideon's sole estate receiver until a formal inquiry could be completed. It also authorized him to gather every account, book, receipt, tally, and bank record connected to the northern properties. Eleanor had predicted those records would be burned. Julian picked up the pen. Gideon watched without speaking. "If I sign this," Julian said, "you will preserve every document." "Of course. You will suspend no payments beyond what is necessary." "Agreed. And you will not remove a single tenant without my written approval." "You have my word." Julian's pen hovered above the page. Julian looked once at the bank manager's letter. He could meet the man at dawn and test Eleanor's accusation. Instead, he chose the appearance of control over the risk of public shame. He signed. The stroke of his pen gave Gideon everything he needed. The stroke of the pen gave Gideon everything he needed. The bank manager arrived before breakfast. Gideon intercepted him in the west courtyard. "His Grace has been called away. I was instructed to speak with the Duke alone. You may leave the documents with me." "I will do no such thing." The manager turned toward his carriage, but two estate officers closed the gates. Gideon showed him Julian's newly signed authority. "You are required to surrender every record connected to the Blackwood Pension Trust. This permits examination. It does not permit seizure. Refuse, and I will report that your bank released protected funds on a forged signature." The manager's face tightened. "You presented that signature, and you accepted it." Neither man moved. At last, the banker handed over a locked leather case. Gideon smiled. By noon, the case and its records had disappeared into the estate office. By 1, the bank manager was on the road to London, carrying Gideon's warning that an arrest warrant would follow if he returned. Julian never learned the man had arrived. At the Dowerkey cottage, Eleanor examined the magistrate's reply to her signed statement. It was worse than she expected. Julian had formally accused her of interfering with estate revenue and concealing documents belonging to the pension inquiry. She was ordered to surrender the copied authorization, the forged receipts, and Martha's tally by noon the following day. If she refused, the magistrate could authorize their seizure. Reverend Grant read the notice over her shoulder. Will he truly send officers here? Julian signed the accusation. He may not understand what Gideon intends to do with it. He understood that I asked him to investigate. He chose not to. The distinction mattered. Eleanor would not excuse her husband simply because another man had benefited from his pride. A stone struck the cottage window. The glass shattered inward. Reverend Grant pulled Eleanor away as a second stone landed beside the hearth. Around it was tied a strip of paper bearing 4 words. "Return what you stole." Outside, several villagers stood beyond the gate. Some were men whose homes Eleanor had protected the previous day. They had been told their rents would rise unless the pension money was recovered from her. Fear had turned gratitude into suspicion. Eleanor opened the door. Reverend Grant caught her arm. "It may not be safe. If I hide, Gideon's lie becomes the only voice they hear." She stepped onto the threshold. "I stole nothing," she called. "Tomorrow morning, I will place every record I possess before the magistrate." A man near the gate raised an eviction notice. "They say you emptied the trust. They have shown you an accusation. I will show you the accounts." "You do not have the accounts." He was right. Gideon controlled the originals. Julian's order now gave him the power to seize Eleanor's copies. But she still possessed one thing Gideon believed had been destroyed. Eleanor held up Martha Bell's wooden tally. "This proves a dead woman was used to hide a false payment. If the estate office has told the truth, its register will contain the matching half." The crowd quieted. A boy came running along the road before anyone could answer. He carried a handbill torn from the door of the Northern Estate Office. Reverend Grant read it aloud. "By authority of the Duke of Blackwood, all rents from the 3 northern villages had been assigned to Harcourt Mercantile Credit in satisfaction of outstanding debt. Every tenant was required to sign a new lease within 48 hours. Eleanor took the handbill. Harcourt was Gideon's family name. Julian's signature had not merely allowed Gideon to seize the pension records. It had allowed him to pledge the village's income to a company he secretly controlled. In 48 hours, the widows would lose more than their pensions. Every home Eleanor had protected would belong to the man who had stolen from them. The first creditors' wagons entered the northern villages before dawn. They carried no furniture, food, or tools. They carried iron locks. Men wearing the badge of Harcourt Mercantile Credit sealed the grain warehouse, the village mill, and the estate office. They posted guards at the bridge and announced that every rent payment would now be collected in Gideon's name. By 7 o'clock, no flour could leave the mill. By 8, The baker had stopped selling bread. Eleanor arrived as two agents were fastening a chain across the warehouse doors. "Remove it," she said. The senior agent unfolded Julian's signed authority. "His Grace assigned these revenues to our company. He assigned the rents, not the buildings. The buildings secure the debt. Show me the agreement." The agent handed her a printed copy, confident that Julian's signature ended the argument. Eleanor read the first page. Eleanor placed one finger beneath the sum on the first page. £20,000, she said, the exact amount taken from the pension trust. Reverend Grant leaned over the agreement. Gideon stole the money and then lent it back through his own company. The senior agent reached for the paper. Eleanor pulled it away. So Blackwood must repay money that already belonged to Blackwood's widows. The agent's mouth hardened. The company advanced lawful credit to the estate, 57 minutes after receiving the same amount from the pension account. No one answered. Eleanor turned to the third page. What happens if the first rent payment is late? The company takes possession of the northern properties, the agent replied. And where was the rent supposed to be delivered? To the estate office. The office your men locked before sunrise. The former bailiff looked toward the chained warehouse. They prevented the tenants from paying. Then they created the default they came to enforce, Reverend Grant said. Eleanor continued reading. A second condition required Blackwood to prove that every widow had received her pension. The wooden tallies were that proof, she said. And Gideon ordered them burned, the clergyman replied. The scheme was suddenly simple enough for every farmer around them to understand. Gideon had stolen the widow's money, returned it as a loan, destroyed the proof of payment, and used the resulting debt to claim their homes. The church clock struck 11. When is the deadline? The former bailiff asked. Noon. We cannot reopen the office in 1 hour. Eleanor opened the tenancy register. Not every tenant pays in money. She turned it toward him. 14 farms pay part of their rent in grain. The warehouse is sealed, he said. The agreement requires delivery to an authorized estate representative. It does not mention the warehouse. The former bailiff looked down at the register. Sir Gideon dismissed me this morning. Did he give you written notice? No. Then you still have authority to receive rent. Reverend Grant moved toward the church door. I will ring the bell. Send every available cart, Eleanor said. If the grain reaches him before noon, Gideon cannot claim the payment was missed. The first bell rang. Across the village, doors opened. Church bells began ringing across the village. Farm carts emerged from every lane, loaded with sacks of barley and wheat. Reverend Grant had sent boys running from house to house, while Eleanor read the contract. The creditor's agents tried to block the road. The villagers did not threaten them. They simply continued forward, dozens of carts moving slowly as one body. At 11:45, the first sack was placed at the bailiff's feet. He issued a receipt. At 11:59, the final cart crossed the bridge. The payment deadline had been met. The company could not lawfully seize the farms that day. Cheers broke out, but Eleanor did not join them. She knew they had delayed Gideon, not defeated him. He still possessed Julian's authority, the original bank records, and the power to issue written dismissal of the bailiff. By the following morning, this defense would no longer work. At Blackwood House, Julian learned of the crisis from a government messenger. The letter did not mention Eleanor. It informed him that his appointment in London had been postponed because Harcourt Mercantile Credit had notified several officials that Blackwood's northern revenues were insolvent. Julian read the sentence twice. The scandal he had tried to avoid now existed because of the authority he had signed to conceal it. Where is Gideon? He demanded. No servant could answer. Julian went to the estate office and found the main room empty. The shelves had been stripped. Ash filled the fireplace. On the floor lay the broken lock from the bank manager's leather case. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway. Did the bank manager come here yesterday? Julian asked. Yes, Your Grace. Julian turned slowly. I was told he never arrived. He waited in the west courtyard. Sir Gideon spoke with him. Why was I not informed? We were ordered not to disturb you. The words landed harder than accusation. Julian had signed the authority. Gideon had used it, exactly as Eleanor warned he would. Yet even now, Julian could not claim he had been helpless. He had held the bank manager's letter in his own hand and chosen reputation over truth. A carriage stood near the stable yard. Gideon emerged from the side entrance carrying the locked bank case. Julian blocked his path. "You lied to me." Gideon did not bother denying it. "I protected the estate from your wife. You pledged 3 villages to your own company. I saved them from insolvency, with money stolen from their pension fund." Gideon's gaze cooled. "Be careful, Julian. Your signature authorized every action I took." Julian reached for the case. 2 creditors' officers stepped between them. Julian stared at men standing on his land, under authority, bearing his own name, and understood that a duke's command meant very little after he had legally granted it to someone else. "You will return those records. When the debt is paid, I revoke your appointment. You may attempt to do so. The company's rights survive your change of heart." Gideon entered the carriage and drove away. At noon, a second notice arrived at the northern village. Harcourt Mercantile Credit rejected the grain payment on the ground that the bailiff's authority had ended before it was received. The company would petition the county creditors' meeting the following afternoon for immediate possession of the farms. Eleanor had less than 24 hours. She could not defeat the claim merely by proving that pension money had vanished. She had to prove that Gideon created the debt, controlled both sides of the agreement, and used Julian's signature to convert theft into ownership. Reverend Grant looked at her across the schoolroom table. "Can it be done?" Eleanor placed Martha's tally beside the company agreement. "Yes," she said, "but only if the evidence Gideon burned was never the only copy." Somewhere outside Blackwood, 12 landowners still possessed the original rental assignments that had funded the pension trust. If Eleanor could reach them before the creditors assembled, Gideon's entire debt would collapse. If she failed, 3 villages would belong to him by sunset. Eleanor divided the 12 landowners into 3 groups. 4 lived close enough to reach before midnight. 3 maintained London agents who could appear at the creditors' meeting. The remaining 5 were too distant to help before the deadline. Reverend Grant sent trusted riders in different directions, each carrying a request written in Eleanor's hand. "Bring the original rental assignment," she instructed. "Do not entrust it to an estate messenger. Come personally or send a sworn representative." The former bailiff sealed each letter and recorded the rider's name, departure time, and destination in the parish register. Nothing would travel without a witness. Eleanor then wrapped Martha's tally in linen and placed it inside the church strongbox. Reverend Grant and the bailiff signed across the wax seal. If Gideon searched the cottage, the object would not be there. If he accused Eleanor of altering it, 2 independent witnesses could describe its condition. The frightened clerk remained hidden outside the county. His written confession had been copied twice. 1 copy stayed with Reverend Grant. The second was sent to the magistrate. For the first time since leaving Blackwood House, Eleanor possessed evidence Gideon could not destroy in a single fire. Hoofbeats sounded outside. Julian entered the schoolroom alone. Every conversation stopped. He looked less like a duke than a man who had ridden without rest. Mud covered his boots, and a tear ran along the sleeve of his coat. "I need to speak with you," he said. Eleanor did not dismiss the others. "You may speak here." His eyes moved toward Reverend Grant and the former bailiff. "Privately." "No. Privacy has protected too many lies." The answer struck him, but he accepted it. "I signed Gideon's authority," he said. "I knew you had asked me to investigate before I did it. I believed I could preserve the estate and settle the truth later. You believed protecting your reputation was more urgent than protecting the people whose money had disappeared." "Yes." No excuse followed. It was the first honest answer he had given her since placing the settlement on the dining table. Julian removed several pages from inside his coat. "These are household accounts from the years you managed Blackwood. I found them in a locked cabinet Gideon overlooked." Eleanor recognized her handwriting. Julian placed 1 page before her. "In our 2nd year of marriage, the Western farms failed. The estate record says an anonymous lender covered the seed debt." Eleanor said nothing. "The lender was you." Reverend Grant looked at her. Julian continued. "You used £6,000 from your marriage trust. You prevented 30 families from losing their farms, and you never placed the estate under obligation to you. The money was available. It was yours. And the farms fed people." He turned another page. "When the pension trust earned less interest than expected, you paid the difference from your pin money. When the mill required repairs, you delayed purchasing a new carriage. When my London expenses exceeded the household allowance, you moved nothing away from tenant wages. His voice roughened. I thought Blackwood survived because I had governed it well. No, Eleanor said. You thought it survived because no one told you what survival cost. Julian lowered his eyes. The room remained silent. I cannot restore what I refuse to see, he said. But I can help. Stop Gideon. Eleanor folded her hands upon the table. You cannot arrive after granting him power and expect to command the rescue. I do not. If we cooperate, it will be under written conditions. Name them. You will appear at the creditors' meeting. You will state publicly that I warned you before you signed Gideon's authority. Julian's face tightened. Such an admission would destroy any remaining chance of receiving his government appointment. Eleanor continued. You will withdraw the accusation against me. You will confirm that the pension payments I made were lawful and came from my personal property. I will. You will surrender your copies of every account to Reverend Grant before the meeting. Julian nodded. And you will not ask me to protect your title, your appointment, or your name from the consequences of what you chose. He looked at her for a long moment. I agree. Eleanor wrote the conditions. Julian signed them without reading past the final line. She pushed the paper back toward him. That habit is what brought us here. Shame crossed his face. He picked it up and read every word. Then he signed again beside the first signature. Shortly before midnight, 2 riders returned. The first carried an original rental assignment, directing £800 annually into the pension trust. The landowner had signed it 3 years earlier in Eleanor's presence. The second brought a sworn statement and another original assignment. Together, the documents proved the trust had received outside income, far greater than Gideon admitted. The former bailiff recorded their arrival. Reverend Grant examined the seals. Eleanor placed both papers inside a leather portfolio and marked the fastening with her father's old stamp. A third rider arrived without his horse. He stumbled into the schoolroom with blood along his temple. Men stopped me at the East Bridge, he said. They took the document. Did you see them? The bailiff asked. One wore the creditor company's badge. Eleanor helped the rider into a chair. Where is the fourth messenger? No one knew. The clock moved past midnight. At 1 a.m, a carriage approached from London. The pension bank manager stepped out. I received Reverend Grant's message, he said. Sir Gideon threatened me into surrendering my records, but he did not know my bank keeps a duplicate transaction book in London. He carried the book beneath his arm. Its entries showed the stolen £20,000 had left the pension trust, passed through a temporary Blackwood account for less than 1 hour, and entered Harcourt Mercantile Credit before returning to the estate as a supposed loan. The fraud now had a complete path. Eleanor asked the manager to state where the book had been kept, who had brought it from London, and whether any page had left his possession. Reverend Grant recorded every answer. At last, they possessed evidence strong enough to defeat Gideon's claim. Then smoke rose beyond the schoolroom windows. Flames were climbing from the dower cottage. Eleanor ran outside as villagers formed a line of water buckets. The fire had already consumed the room where Gideon believed she kept the copied authorizations and the clerk's confession. The proof was safe elsewhere. But the burning cottage was a distraction. The church bell began ringing violently. Reverend Grant reached the door first. The church strongbox had been forced open. Martha's tally was gone. On the floor lay the strip of linen that had wrapped it, and beside it, the torn seal from Eleanor's leather portfolio. She turned toward the table. The 2 original rental assignments had vanished as well. Gideon had discovered how close she was to proving everything, and before the creditors assembled, he had taken the only originals in her possession. By morning, Gideon's version of the fire had reached every village. Duchess Eleanor, the printed notice claimed, had burned the dower cottage to destroy records proving she had stolen the pension fund. She had then broken into the church and removed evidence entrusted to Reverend Grant. The truth had been reversed before the ashes cooled. At 8 o'clock, 2 magistrates' officers arrived at the schoolroom. They carried a warrant to seize the bank's duplicate transaction book and every remaining document in Eleanor's possession. The bank manager stepped in front of his ledger. This is the property of my institution. The bank is suspected of assisting the Duchess, an officer replied. You may challenge the seizure before the magistrate. After the creditors have taken the villages? That is not my concern. Eleanor examined the warrant. Gideon had sworn that the transaction book was false, prepared after he threatened to report the bank for accepting forged instructions. Until its authenticity could be established, the creditors' meeting would not consider it. The manager looked at Eleanor. "If I surrender this, you will have nothing. If you resist, they will arrest you and call that proof of conspiracy." She closed the ledger herself and placed it in the officer's hands. "Record that it left the bank manager's possession under warrant," she told Reverend Grant. The clergyman entered the time in the parish register. Even in defeat, Eleanor protected the chain of custody. The officers searched the schoolroom next. They found the clerk's copied confession, but dismissed it because the clerk himself was absent. They found Eleanor's copies of the forged authorization, but Gideon had already labelled them imitations. By 10 o'clock, everything she had gathered was either missing, seized, or publicly discredited. Then the fourth messenger returned. He rode into the village leading an empty horse. Eleanor ran outside. "Where is the landowner's assignment?" The man's face answered before he spoke. "Taken. 2 riders followed me from the western road. They knew what I carried." All 4 original assignments had been intercepted. Gideon had sealed every escape. The creditors assembled at Blackwood House rather than the county hall. Gideon claimed the estate contained the necessary records and that moving them would create delay. In truth, the location allowed him to control the doors, servants, and documents. Eleanor entered beside Reverend Grant and the former bailiff. Whispers followed her across the room. The burned cottage had blackened the hem of her dress. She had refused to change it. If Gideon wished to use the fire against her, she would not pretend it had never happened. Julian stood near the long table. The unsigned separation settlement remained where Eleanor had left it. Her wedding ring was gone. She did not ask who had taken it. Gideon addressed the creditors. Blackwood's financial difficulty arose when the Duchess diverted pension income, concealed rental assignments, and distributed private funds to prevent discovery. Harcourt Mercantile Credit intervened only after the estate could no longer meet its obligations. He presented the 2 original assignments stolen from Eleanor's portfolio. Both had been partly burned. "The documents were recovered near the Dower cottage," he said. Her Grace evidently attempted to destroy them. Eleanor stared at the scorched edges. Gideon had burned her home so he could claim everything taken from the church had been found inside it. One creditor examined the papers. "These assignments show substantial income entering the pension trust." "They are incomplete," Gideon replied. "The missing pages contained cancellation clauses signed by the landowners." "No such clauses existed," Eleanor said. "Then produce complete copies." He knew she could not. Gideon placed a charred wooden tally beside the assignments. Number 17. This was also recovered from the Duchess's cottage. It proves she retained payment tokens after recording them as distributed. The lie worked because no one in the room understood the tally system, as Eleanor did. Gideon concluded calmly. "The company therefore requests immediate possession of the northern revenues until Blackwood's debt is discharged." Several creditors nodded. The chairman reached for his pen. "Before you decide," Julian said, "you will hear how Gideon obtained the authority he used." Gideon's eyes narrowed. Julian stepped into the center of the room. "My wife warned me that the pension records contained forged signatures. A bank manager requested a private meeting. I refused to investigate because I feared a scandal would cost me a government appointment." The creditors fell silent. "I then signed an order removing Eleanor from the trust and granting Gideon control of the estate records. I did so after she warned me those records would be destroyed." Gideon interrupted. "His Grace is speaking under emotional pressure." "No, I am speaking after months of cowardice." Julian placed his signed agreement with Eleanor before the chairman. "I withdraw every accusation made against my wife. The emergency pension payments came from the sale of her personal bracelet. She did not steal from Blackwood. She repeatedly used her own property to keep Blackwood solvent." The chairman studied him. "Are you admitting negligence in the management of these estates?" "I am admitting that my deliberate refusal to examine evidence enabled this claim." The admission ended Julian's political future. It also made him personally answerable for losses caused by the authority he had granted, but it did not restore the missing proof. The chairman postponed final possession until noon the next day. Unless Eleanor produced authenticated evidence before then, the creditor company would take control of all northern revenues. Gideon had still won. Eleanor returned to the schoolroom after dark. She sat alone before the cold hearth, staring at an empty space where Martha's tally had rested. Julian entered, but remained near the door. "I told the truth," he said. "You told it after your silence became impossible." "I know." He did not ask whether his confession had changed anything between them. That restraint was the first mercy he had offered her. "They have the assignments," he said. "They have the bank book. What remains?" Eleanor thought of Gideon placing Martha's tally before the creditors. He had sworn that it came from her cottage, but the former bailiff had seen it fall from an estate officer's case before the cottage burned. That contradiction mattered more than the shape of the wood. "The tally does not prove I stole anything," Eleanor said. "It proves Gideon lied about where he found it." "He will call the bailiff dishonest," Julian replied. "Then I will make him repeat the lie under oath." "And after that?" Eleanor looked toward the parish register. "We give him a witness he believes can no longer contradict him." She began writing a notice announcing that the clerk had been found dead beside the eastern road. Julian understood. If Gideon believes the only witness is dead, he may speak more freely. "Not merely speak," Eleanor said. "He will lie about something only the living clerk can contradict." At noon, Gideon expected to take 3 villages. Instead, Eleanor would force him to authenticate the evidence against himself. Before dawn, Reverend Grant rode beyond the county boundary. He returned 3 hours later, with the frightened pension clerk concealed beneath a carriage blanket. The young man entered the church through the vestry and remained there with the bank manager and 2 village witnesses. The former bailiff guarded the outer door. No estate servant knew the clerk had returned. Meanwhile, notices announcing his supposed death appeared along the eastern road. By 9 o'clock, one reached Blackwood House. Gideon read it twice. Then he requested permission to submit new evidence at the creditors' meeting. Eleanor's trap had begun. At noon, the long dining table was surrounded by creditors, landowners, tenants, and the 12 witnesses who had watched Julian offer his wife the doubled settlement. The same room that had witnessed her public rejection would now judge whether her name deserved ruin. Gideon stood first. "The missing clerk died while fleeing the county," he announced. Before his death, he confessed that Duchess Eleanor ordered him to forge pension receipts so she could retain the money. He placed a folded statement before the chairman. It bore the clerk's signature and Reverend Grant's name as witness. The clergyman remained absent from the room, exactly as Eleanor had planned. Gideon continued. The Duchess then removed Martha Bell's tally from the payment office and concealed it in her cottage. When an inquiry became unavoidable, she burned the cottage and attempted to destroy the rental assignments. He presented the charred papers and wooden tally once more. His story was complete, orderly, and false. The chairman looked toward Eleanor. "Do you deny these accusations?" "I do, but first, I ask Sir Gideon to confirm them under oath." Gideon smiled. "I welcome the opportunity." A Bible was brought. He swore that the clerk had written the confession voluntarily, that Martha's tally had been recovered from Eleanor's cottage, and that Harcourt Mercantile Credit had received no pension money before lending £20,000 to Blackwood. Eleanor waited until every statement had been entered into the official record. Then she approached the table. "Who found the tally in my cottage?" "One of the men searching the ruins." "Name him." "The conditions were chaotic. I do not recall which man carried it out." "Was the tally wrapped?" Gideon hesitated. "No." "Was it burned?" "Along one edge." "And you concluded it belonged to Martha Bell because it bears the number 17. "Yes." Eleanor turned toward the former bailiff. "Where did you first see this object?" The man stepped forward. "It fell from an estate officer's dispatch case outside the widow cottages. That was before the dower cottage burned." A murmur spread through the room. Gideon dismissed him with a glance. A disgruntled former employee. "Were you present?" Eleanor asked. "I was not." "Then you cannot deny what he witnessed." She lifted the tally. "This is the widow's half. It was never kept in the payment office. Gideon's men collected it from Martha's cottage after her death, then tried to burn it with the others." "That is speculation." "Then let us ask the person who burned them." The vestry door opened. The pension clerk entered beside Reverend Grant. Gideon's face changed. Not dramatically, only a slight tightening around the eyes. But Eleanor saw the instant he understood that his sworn statement could no longer be withdrawn. The clerk faced the chairman. "I am not dead. I did not write that confession." Reverend Grant examined the signature supposedly bearing his witness. "I have never seen this document before." Gideon recovered quickly. They have been bribed. With what? Eleanor asked. The fortune you accuse me of stealing. A few creditors laughed, but she did not allow the moment to become theatre. She placed the original pension receipts before the clerk. Did you write these names? Yes. Who instructed you? Sir Gideon. Did you copy my countersignature? No, the withdrawal orders were already signed when they reached me. Eleanor faced the creditors. The widow's names and my signature were forged by different hands. The clerk has admitted one. We will now identify the other. S. Gideon folded his arms. You have no qualified examiner. I do not require one. Eleanor turned to the bank manager. The magistrate's officers brought forward the duplicate transaction book they had seized under warrant. The manager checked its seal and recorded that it remained unbroken. He opened it before the creditors. This entry shows £20,000 leaving the pension trust, he said. It passed through Blackwood's account and entered Harcourt Mercantile Credit on the same morning. And when did the company return the money as a loan? Eleanor asked. 57 minutes later. The room fell silent. Gideon leaned toward the table. The bank created that entry after joining the Duchess's conspiracy. Then explain your countersignature on the transfer order. It proves only that I delivered a document she had already signed. Eleanor looked toward Julian. He rose. I received the bank's original transfer order before granting Gideon authority. I saw both signatures. Eleanor's was dated while she was at Martha Bell's deathbed. I chose not to investigate. I. He did not attempt to soften his responsibility. Eleanor continued. Who owned Harcourt Mercantile Credit when the transfer occurred? Gideon answered carefully. A private partnership. Controlled by whom? My family holds an interest. The chairman consulted the company agreement. You are listed as managing partner. Gideon's jaw tightened. Two landowners then stepped forward. They had arrived that morning, after receiving Eleanor's messages. Both swore their rental assignments had never been cancelled. The burned pages Sir Gideon claims contained cancellation clauses never existed, one said. My original was stolen from my messenger. The second pointed toward Gideon. His company attempted to turn money we gave the widows into a debt against the same widows' homes. The chairman looked shaken, but Gideon raised a hand. None of this proves I forged the Duchess's name. The bank transfer may have benefited my company, but Eleanor's signature authorized it. That was the final wall behind which he could hide. Eleanor placed a clean sheet of paper before him. If you did not write my name, then this will cost you nothing. What do you want? Write the sentence you claim the clerk confessed. Gideon did not move. The chairman spoke. You have sworn that the confession is genuine. Write the words. With every eye upon him, Gideon took up the silver pen, the same pen Julian had offered Eleanor with the settlement. He wrote, Duchess Eleanor ordered the receipts copied and kept the pension money. Eleanor placed his sentence beside the forged authorization. The downward strokes ended with the same small hook. Gideon pushed back his chair. Similar penmanship proves nothing. Alone, perhaps not, Eleanor said. But the person who saw you write my signature is waiting behind that door. Every face turned toward the entrance. Eleanor asked Reverend Grant to bring in the final witness. Reverend Grant opened the door. The Blackwood housekeeper entered. She had served the family for 31 years and had stood in the entrance hall when Eleanor discovered her father's legal papers missing. Now, she walked past Julian without seeking his permission. Gideon's face tightened. Eleanor asked, What did you see in my study on the morning my belongings were packed? The housekeeper faced the chairman. Sir Gideon ordered 2 estate men to search Her Grace's walnut box. After they left, I returned for the study keys. And what was he doing? He had placed one of the Duchess's old letters beneath a thin sheet of paper. He was copying her signature onto 3 bank orders. Gideon rose. This woman is a servant dismissed for disobedience. I was not dismissed, she replied. You threatened to remove my widowed daughter from her cottage if I spoke. The chairman looked toward the forged authorization. Can you identify this document? The housekeeper approached it. This was one of the 3 orders. I remember the amount, because I thought no pension account could possibly contain £20,000. Eleanor placed Gideon's newly written sentence beside the forged signature. The same hooked strokes were visible in both. The housekeeper pointed to the final letter. He paused there each time. He could copy the Duchess's name, but he never joined the last 2 letters as she does. The room moved from doubt into silence. Then the bank manager spoke. My transaction book proves Sir Gideon presented that order and transferred the money into his own company. The clerk added, he later ordered me to copy the widows' names so the missing funds would appear lawfully distributed. The former bailiff identified Martha's tally as the object that had fallen from Gideon's officer's case before the fire. The two landowners confirmed their rental assignments had never been cancelled. No single piece stood alone. Together, they formed a chain Gideon could no longer break. He stepped away from the table. You cannot place the entire matter upon me. Julian signed the company agreement. Julian did not retreat from the accusation. I did, after Eleanor warned me. You wanted her removed. You wanted the pension inquiry silenced before London learned your household was collapsing. Yes. The admission deprived Gideon of his final defence. Eleanor faced the creditors. That is how this scheme succeeded. Gideon knew Julian intended to separate from me and feared losing his appointment. He transferred £20,000 out of the pension trust using my forged signature. The money passed into Harcourt Mercantile Credit and returned 57 minutes later as a supposed loan to Blackwood. She touched the false receipts. To hide the withdrawal, he forced the clerk to create payments that never occurred. He collected the widow's tallies and ordered them burned. When Julian removed me from the accounts, Gideon gained access to every record capable of exposing him. The chairman looked at the unsigned settlement. And the doubled offer? The first £20,000 was the separate maintenance promised in our marriage articles, Eleanor said. The second half was drawn from the pension money Gideon had already moved through the estate. The bank manager nodded. If Her Grace had signed for the entire £40,000, the withdrawal could have been presented as part of an authorised marital settlement. And I would have appeared responsible for emptying the fund, Eleanor said. My departure would have removed the only trustee who knew how the account was built. Gideon had expected greed, shame, and urgency to finish what forgery began. Instead, Eleanor had accepted only half and named the people who should receive the rest. That decision had exposed everything. Gideon moved toward the door. The magistrate's officers blocked him. The chairman formally rejected Harcourt Mercantile Credit's claim. The company's assets were frozen pending repayment of the stolen pension money. Gideon was taken into custody on accusations of fraud, forgery, perjury, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to seize the northern properties. The cottage fire would be investigated separately. The young clerk was not absolved. He had forged the widows' names, but his cooperation, his mother's threatened eviction, and his testimony were entered for the magistrate to consider. By sunset, the chains were removed from the mill and warehouse. The northern villages remained Blackwood land, but no longer under Julian's unchecked control. 1 week later, the same 12 witnesses returned to the long dining room. This time, Julian stood while Eleanor sat at the head of the table. Before them lay a new agreement. Julian publicly withdrew every accusation he had made against his wife. He acknowledged the £6,000 she had used to save the Western farms and every payment she had made from her private allowance. He surrendered management of the northern revenues to an independent trust chaired by Eleanor and 2 elected tenant representatives. He also transferred the repaired dower property and sufficient income for her separate household into trustees beyond his control. His government appointment was formally withdrawn. He did not protest. Last, Julian placed £40,000 before Eleanor, the doubled settlement he had once offered to be rid of her. The first half is what our marriage articles promised, he said. The second is restitution for the harm my decision enabled. Neither requires your silence, forgiveness, or return. Eleanor picked up the silver pen. No one commanded her to sign before sunset. She accepted £20,000 for her independent maintenance. Across the remaining amount, she wrote instructions, creating a permanent fund for the widows, tenant families, and estate workers whose homes had been threatened. Julian watched her name the recipients. You offered twice the money because you believed a fortune would make me disappear, she said. You never understood that security means little when it is purchased with someone else's hunger. I understand now. No, you have begun to understand. He lowered his head. I am sorry, Eleanor. I chose pride when you offered me truth. I treated your questions as disloyalty because answering them would have required me to admit how little I knew about the estate and about you. She studied him. His apology did not restore trust. His losses did not entitle him to comfort. Even his public honesty had arrived only after his betrayal endangered hundreds of lives. But he had finally named his wrong without asking her to make it smaller. "What happens to us?" he asked. "I will live at the dower house after it is rebuilt. May I write to you? You may write once each month." Hope entered his face, but Eleanor raised a hand. "I promise only that I will decide whether to read the letters. If trust ever returns, it will return through what you do when no one is watching." "I accept that." Julian removed her wedding ring from his pocket and placed it beside the settlement. He did not offer it to her. He simply stepped back. Eleanor left the ring where it lay. Outside, the widows waited beside the estate workers and tenants. Eleanor carried the signed trust agreement down the steps. Martha Bell's name appeared first, not as a false recipient, but as the name of the cottage that would shelter pension families in need. Eleanor handed the agreement to Reverend Grant for safekeeping. Then she gave the silver pen to Martha's eldest granddaughter, who would become the trust's first paid clerk. Behind Eleanor, the doors of Blackwood House remained open. Ahead of her, the road to the northern villages was crowded with people waiting to walk beside her. This time, she did not leave because a duke had paid her to disappear. She left because the future was finally hers to name.